Dear teachers, welcome to this session. As you know, the new competence-based curriculum in Uganda emphasizes learner-centered pedagogy. This means that instead of us, the teachers, standing in front of the classroom and giving all the answers, our learners must now take an active role in discovering knowledge. But there is also a challenge. Sometimes, if we stick to only one teaching method, learners may lose interest, or they may fail to fully develop the skills, values, and attitudes that the CBC emphasizes. That's why today we will explore 3 alternate teaching approaches that can make lessons more engaging, practical, and meaningful. These are the 5 E's model. This approach helps learners to engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate knowledge. It is especially useful in sciences and a number of practical subjects. Then we also look at the interactive approach. This method turns the classroom into a partnership between teachers and learners. Learners ask questions, investigate, and reflect. It gives them ownership of their learning. Then we also look at predict, observe, explain, POE. This is a very effective method in science and practical lessons. Learners make predictions, observe outcomes, and explain results. This approach directly challenges misconceptions and builds critical thinking. So by the end of this session, you will see that these approaches are not just about abstract theories. They are practical tools that we can use in the classrooms here. Even in schools with limited resources, they will allow learners to become more involved, more curious, and more responsible for their own learning journey. And so, as we move, these are the steps we're going to follow. Now, let's look at the 5 E's approach, which is a constructive model. Colleagues, the 5 E's model is one of the most practical approaches we can use under the competence-based curriculum because it is rooted in constructivism, the belief that learners build their own understanding through experiences. Let us walk through the 5 phases using an example from Senior 1 Biology, Engage. Here we capture learners' attention and spark curiosity. For example, you might bring in a wilted plant into class and ask, why do you think this plant looks like this? This creates curiosity and connects them to their everyday experiences. Then we move to explore. Learners actively investigate the problem. In this case, they could check the soil moisture levels of the wilted plant compared to a healthy one. At this stage, the teacher steps back and allows learners to engage hands-on. Then there is explain. Learners share what they have discovered, and the teacher steps in to clarify and correct misconceptions. For example, after learners give their ideas, you can explain how water transport happens in plants through the xylem. Then elaborate. Learners extend their understanding by connecting it to real-life situations. For instance, they can relate the wilting to why crops suffer during dry season. They might even suggest methods like mulching or irrigation. Then we come to evaluate. Finally, learners demonstrate their understanding. This can be through group presentations, posters, or answering reflective questions. The focus is not just on recall, but on applying what they have learned. So the beauty of the 5 E's is that it ensures active involvement of learners, makes learning experiential, and encourages learners to move beyond demonstration towards problem solving and critical thinking. Even in schools with limited resources, we can still apply this model by using locally available materials, plants, soil, water, and by encouraging learners to use their own observation from their home environment. So many resources available, and we can be able to do something great. now let's move to something else, the interactive approach. Now, colleagues, let's look at this interactive approach, which is another very, very powerful method under the competence-based curriculum. Unlike traditional teaching, where the teacher dictates the content, here the classroom becomes a partnership between a teacher and learners. This method has 4 stages. Number 1 is preparation. Like we've seen our emphasis here. Number 1 is preparation. Number 2 is learners' questions, where students pose questions. Then number 3 is investigation, where learners research. And then number 4 is reflection. So let me explain a little more about preparation. So the teacher here introduces the topic and sets the scene. For example, in history, you might introduce the topic of Uganda's independence. You can give learners brief context, and this can give some serious step there. So you can give learners brief context about colonial rule, national movements, and then you also move to a good level there. So you talk about leaders like that. So the learners' question could be, here, learners take charge by asking some questions. So for instance, they might ask, why did Uganda want independence? How did the ordinary people participate in the struggle? Or what were the challenges after independence? So this phase ensures learners' curiosity drives the lesson, not just the teacher's plan. Then we also have investigation. Learners now go and find answers. Depending on the resources, they can use textbooks, they can use the KAWA CONNECT, they can use library books and the videos, or even interview elders in the community who lived through independence. This connects the school, it connects school learning with the real life knowledge. Then reflection. Finally, learners come back to share their findings. They might present in groups, or make posters, or hold the class discussion. This stage helps them to refine their ideas, compare perspectives, and learn to think critically and collaboratively. So the beauty of the interactive approach is that it gives learners ownership of their learning. They don't just sit and receive information, they participate, ask, investigate, and reflect. So this approach also builds key CBC skills such as critical thinking, research, communication, and collaboration. And it works in all subjects: history, geography, literature, agriculture, even any science subject. So as teachers, our role shifts to guiding, facilitating, and probing with good questions rather than the basic spoon feeding which we used to do. So we now move to another approach called predict, observe, explain, POE. Colleagues, the predict, observe, explain method is especially powerful in science and mathematics because it allows learners to test their assumptions and confront misconceptions. Here is how it works step by step. Predict. Start by asking learners to make a prediction based on their prior knowledge or beliefs. For example, in Senior 2 Physics, you might ask, if we drop a coin and a feather in a vacuum, which one will hit the ground first? Most learners will predict the coin because of what they see in a real life. Then also when it comes to observe. So next, learners observe the actual experiment, demonstration, or video. In this example, when the coin and the feather are dropped in a vacuum tube, learners see that they fall at the same rate. This observation surprises them and creates curiosity. And then will now come to explain, finally guide learners to explain why the results happened. Here they realize that in normal conditions, air resistance affects the feather's motion, but in a vacuum there is no air to slow it down. This helps correct their earlier misconception and builds accurate scientific reasoning. So the strength of this approach is that one, it activates prior knowledge by letting learners make predictions, and two, it engages curiosity when learners see something unexpected, and then it also builds deeper understanding when they reason through the explanation, and it can be applied in many subjects. So in biology, learners can predict what will happen when a seed kept in a dark cupboard, observe its growth, and then explain the role of light in photosynthesis. In chemistry, learners can predict the effect of heating a metal, observe the color change or reaction, and then explain using particle theory. In mathematics, they can predict patterns in number sequences, test them, and then explain the rule behind the pattern. Then you could also have predict, observe, explain method as a very simple but very effective for competence-based curriculum, because it encourages learners to think critically, ask why and what if, and refine their understanding through evidence. So as we conclude, let us reflect on why these alternate teaching methods are so important in the CBC. So the CBC is not about how much content the learner can memorize, but how well they can apply knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to real-life situations. Approaches like the five E's, the interactive method, and the predict, observe, explain reduce teachers' talk and shift the focus to the learner. So instead of being passive listeners, learners become active participants, predicting, experimenting, questioning, reflecting, and presenting. So this not only makes lessons more fun and engaging, but also ensures learners develop critical thinking, collaboration, and problem-solving skills. For example, in science lessons, learners don't just copy notes. They conduct experiments, and they observe, then explain. In history or geography, they don't just memorize independence dates. They investigate why independence mattered and how it shapes our country today. In mathematics, instead of repeating formulas, they solve real life problems like budgeting or measuring land. Ultimately, when we use these approaches, we prepare learners not just for passing exams, but succeed in life. That is the heart of the CBC, and that's why your role as a teacher, becoming a facilitator, is a crucial one. So now you have had all this, take a step and ensure that you play a role in